Tom, thank you for being here again today. We wanted to focus today on the latest projections about the economy from the Congressional Budget Office. They're notable primarily because they're longer term in nature. They go out 10 years all the way to 2030, and we wanted to ask you about those. Let's bring up the first chart showing U.S. GDP. The skinny bars in this chart represent the close-in years, and then the fatter bars are annual averages for 2023 and 2024, and then the 5-year period starting in 2025. What do you see when you look at this chart?
They're telling us that the long-term growth trajectory of this economy is, just north of 2%. So just above inflation. If we assume inflation is below the 2% Fed target, we are having positive growth, but not a lot. And positive growth is a good thing, but this level of growth is not great. And in our separate conversations we've had about our long-term debt dynamics and the like, we're clearly not, if this is remotely right, going to grow out of our debt problems.
The innate growth rate of the U.S. economy, if you go back to World War II, I think a lot of people think of 3% as the number, although after the Great Recession, we had kind of settled into a 2% economy, but this kind of looks like that 2% economy we had before.
Yeah, in the long scheme of decades, what you find is countries that start from low levels of economic development can grow very rapidly for long periods of time, but as you become more prosperous and your per capita income gets higher and higher, growth rates tend to slow down, right? And ours are slowing down for a lot of other obvious objective reasons, like the demographic dynamics of this country. We don't have much population growth, which is a pretty important input into growth in GDP. So while its expectations are positive over the next 10 years, we're not going to grow our way out of any of our significant constraints and challenges.
Let's go to the next chart, which shows the 10-year projection for employment. What do you see here?
This is a particularly interesting set of graphical expressions of unemployment expectations over the next 10 years. Unemployment level is at the lowest level in my lifetime pre-COVID. It's now going to be at the highest level in my lifetime right now. And the question is, over what period of time does that unemployment level pull down to, long-term averages or something like that? And the answer to that is it's going to take quite a while. As we've talked about it in other conversations, the economy is going to bounce back clearly, but it's not going to bounce back and look exactly like the pre-COVID economy, right? Take some industries, for example, airlines, hotels, leisure, etc. Some of those are just not going to come back in the same way. And therefore, employment levels in some of those industries are not going to return to pre-COVID levels. What's probably even more interesting is, since that's the aggregate level for the entire country, the economic, social, and health effects on the population of the United States are hugely uneven in their impact. So African Americans, Latinos, other minorities, people at the lower end also of the economic earnings continuum and the like, have often been lost their jobs more quickly, or have jobs where they're not able to do what I do, which is work safely from home with very little impact. They have to go and do things that are expose them to COVID. They have worse health outcomes because they don't have necessarily the same medical health provision, and on and on. There's a complicated chain of these interconnections. So while this may be the aggregate, underneath this, when you unpack it, what you will find is certain sectors of our population are going to have much worse outcomes than this.
Let's go to the next chart, which shows 10-year Treasury yields, again, as predicted by the CBO. What do you see here?
When rates are this low, it's generally a sign that the economy is not robust and healthy, right? We know that to be true now. And the CBO is telling us they don't expect the 10-year government borrowing rate even to get back to 3% in the next 10 years. So that's just telling you that the economic performance is relatively anemic. The cost of borrowing, certainly for the government, is going to remain low, and there are reasons to be, concerned about that. On the other hand, the United States government is an enormous borrower in its own right. And so the cost of carrying the enormous and rapidly growing debt load carried on the backs of all of us as taxpayers, funded through the United States government, we benefit dramatically from the fact that cost of borrowing and the cost of servicing that accumulated and rapidly growing debt load is going to remain very, very low, thank goodness. And that is going to buy us a meaningful amount of time to put our fiscal house in order for the long term.
A couple more questions. We want to pivot now to a few pieces of seemingly positive news that have come out and get you to react to those. Starting with the chart we'll bring up next, which is the equity markets as reflected in the S&P 500. They lost about a third of their value after COVID. They've since recovered almost, I think, more than 80% as of today of what they lost. What does that tell you? What should we draw from that in terms of interpreting it?
Well, it's easy, and it's often done that people overinterpret or misinterpret what this means. It's simply the value cumulatively of all of the publicly traded companies in this index. And what is interesting about it, per your question, is the expectation of the capital markets on the future earnings capability of all those publicly traded companies is not bad. It's actually pretty good, and it's probably meaningfully more optimistic about the future earnings capability of corporate America than all the other stuff that we've already looked at: unemployment rates, GDP expectations, and so forth.
Final chart, which shows, again, a seeming bit of good news, which is monthly job creation over the past 3 months. There's obviously a huge decline here in showing 20 million jobs lost, but then we've had a bounce back here. Talk about that.
The good news is, there are a lot of people who were probably lost their jobs, got fired, furloughed, or what have you, but technically lost their jobs in March and April. And those businesses, as we reopen and activity gets on a recovery trajectory, a lot of those people get called quickly back. That's great, right? That's great for those people. I don't view that necessarily as kind of new job creation. I view that predominantly as existing businesses who had to shed labor to survive, bringing that labor back online as they resume more normalized operations.
Last question. Are you surprised at all, pleasantly surprised about how agile the U.S. economy is or seems to be right now? Or is this simply basically the result of all the stimulus that's come in from the government? I mean, how much credit should the real economy take for some of this good news that's occurred?
The intrinsic strengths of our economy are what they are. But the fact is, fiscal and monetary authorities in this country could have buried their head in the sand, and this situation that we see, that we're already measuring, that's behind us, would have been even worse. So we fell into a hole, not of our own creation, but it wasn't quite as deep as it would have been. But we're still going to have to climb out of it. And it's going to take us, as we've talked about today, quite a bit of time to climb out of it.